Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to part 4 of our Watering Wisdom, Growing a Healthy Lawn with Less Water webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking about lawn care best management practices. And as we have done in the previous webinars, I just want to quickly go over our future webinars. We only have one more, our 5th and final webinar. It is entitled Winterizing Your Lawn, and that will happen in 3 weeks. And we haven't put this up yet, but I just wanted to remind everyone that you can view our previous 3 webinars and access PDF versions of each of those webinars at the website that you see down there below. Now, a lot of what we're going to talk about today is going to be online as well. And before we get into the presentation, just a quick reminder of using Zoom. If this is your first time joining us, the chat function is disabled, so you won't be able to talk amongst yourselves. But if you hover over the Q&A box and press it, you should see something like the chat box on the right. And that's where you can type in your questions. We also have the live transcript or the closed captioning available at the bottom. It should be going for everyone, and that can be turned off depending on your device if you'd like to turn it off. But I just want to reiterate that we will have a Q&A session at the end. But please, as questions arise during the presentation, feel free to write them in that Q&A box. And Chris Moncada will be leading that Q&A session. And then we have Dr. Eric Watkins from here at the University of Minnesota and Dr. Brian Davis of the Metropolitan Council and me, of course, who will be our panelist and answering those questions as best we can. So moving forward, again, talking about lawn care best management practices, I'm going to be the sole presenter today. So let's go ahead and jump right in. I just want to give a quick overview of some of the things that I thought about when making a list of lawn care best management practices. Now, if you've been joining us for all of these webinars, you might recognize the picture on the right. I've used it before, but this is a picture of one of our research sites at the University of Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. And the reason I have this picture up here is one, I am currently going through the process of doing these best management practices here at or I guess not here, but at the Landscape Arboretum. And two, just to remind you that even though, things aren't fully open at the Arboretum right now, when the time comes for that to happen and maybe into next year, please come and check this research site out, as we will be consistently adding to it for the rest of this year and moving into next year. And I'd love to answer some questions about smart irrigation controllers or lawn care best management practices. But we're not going to have time to go over each and every one of these best management practices. And there's others that aren't listed. But I wanted to focus on mowing, fertilization, and then some other maintenance practices that I felt were important to discuss today. So jumping right into mowing, I wanted to start off with some more simple best management practices. But if you have a gas-powered mower, you need to change the oil in that mower, at least once a year. It's going to help it run cleaner, allow that mower to have a longer lifespan. And if you happen to have an electric mower, as you see in the picture in the bottom right, you may not need to change the oil, but the second bullet point there is for both of these types of mowers, and that's washing the underside of your lawnmower. That can lead to, as you can read there, seed contamination and make it a little hard to start the next time you come and mow. As far as seed contamination goes, if you mow an area that has a lot of weeds and then you move to let's say your neighbor wants you to mow their yard, and you do that, and their yard doesn't have to have a lot of weeds, you might contaminate their lawn with some of the weeds from the spot that you just mowed. And if you've ever started your lawnmower and seen some of those large chunks of dry lawn clippings that pop out when you start it, that can happen due to mowing when it's really wet, not washing the underside of that lawnmower, and it has, a week or so to dry out and can make it hard to start and maybe do some damage to that blade or the mower itself. The one I want to emphasize a little bit more is that last one of keeping your blade sharp. This is something that a lot of people don't do, but we want to emphasize that a clean cut and having a sharp blade is something that's going to equal a healthy lawn. And just to point that out here, we have a picture of some dull blades and some cleanly cut blades. You can see the dull blades on the left there. They leave some of those jagged edges. They kind of look white and wispy and can lead to the plant being more susceptible to disease and potentially using, a little bit more water as they try to recuperate and things. That's why we associate a cleanly cut blade with, helping to conserve a little bit of water. And in addition to that, it helps maintain plant health and it looks good. Now, a lot of questions, or one of the main questions I get asked is, how high should I maintain my mowing height? And the first bullet point there says, we suggest you maintain a lawn height above 3 inches. Now follow along with this little graphic on the right. It says as mowing height decreases, depth of rooting decreases, grass plants become thinner, and additional maintenance is required. And when it comes to water use and helping you, conserve a little bit of water while maintaining that healthy lawn, when an irrigation event occurs or a rainstorm happens, the water goes into the soil and slowly, the word we use is percolates, its way down into the soil profile. And when you maintain a height above 3 inches, your roots are going to go deeper into that soil profile and be able to access that water that fell, whether by rain or whether by a sprinkler system. It's going to be able to access that water for a longer period of time, meaning you don't have to water as often. When it comes to the second bullet point there, the 1/3 rule, we also suggest you do not mow more than 1/3 of the height of grass in one cut. So in our example of maintaining a lawn of 3 inches, if you multiply that by 1.33, it means you need to cut your yard or your lawn before it reaches a height of 4.5 inches. And the reason we have this 1/3 rule is because as the plant gets taller, important parts of the plant are at higher points in the yard. And so if you do happen to mow off more than 1/3, it's going to take a little bit longer for that grass to recuperate, and you actually, damaged it to some degree, making it, maybe more susceptible to disease, things like that. But when you mow less than 1/3, you're not going to be cutting off many of those vital parts of the turfgrass plant. And ultimately, the last bullet point there, and as it reiterates again in the graphic, is if you have a lower mowing height, there's going to be more maintenance required, and you're probably going to have to water more frequently because the roots are so shallow in that soil profile. Now, we've done some research here at the University of Minnesota to kind of illustrate these points. And so to kind of walk through what we have presented here, these 6 pictures are a perennial ryegrass dominant stand. And the pictures on the right here, the 6 you see, are a fine fescue dominant mixture. Now, we have 3 pictures of each showing a height of 3.5 inches when, we maintained a mowing height of 3.5 inches. And in another height of 2 inches. Now, I've kind of put a key up there at the top, but this 14 DAI is essentially stating these pictures were taken 14 days after the last irrigation or rain event. And what you can tell, whether it's looking at the perennial rye or the fine fescues, is after 14 days without any water, the 3.5 inch height, they look fairly green. But when you look at the 2 inches in both scenarios, you may start to see a little bit of browning, some of the grass plants starting to go dormant. And we continued this experiment for 60 days. And so when we took pictures after 60 days without any water, you start to see basically the entire stand here of perennial ryegrass, whether it's at 3.5 inches or 2 inches, are, just have that kind of yellow, brownish, dead looking color. When we move over to the fine fescues, you're able to still see some green areas, essentially stating that these fine fescues are a little bit more, drought tolerant when compared to the perennial ryegrass mixtures. And then after that 2 months or 60 days without any water, we instituted a 28-day recovery period where we did, let rain fall on the plots. We irrigated them, and you can see all of them came back to be fairly healthy. But if we look at these 2-inch Haida cuts, you can see there's a little bit more of these kind of darker grayish, brownish areas where there may have been some turf death that occurred. And the same slide is shown here, but here we have a mixture of grasses. And on the right here, these 6 pictures illustrate a tall fescue dominant mixture. Now the same trends kind of continue when you look at 14 days without any water, and you compare the 3.5 inches of Haida cut for the turf to the 2 inches. Again, you start to see kind of these brownish areas begin to show up in the 2 inches as compared to the 3.5 inches. Look pretty good. Again, going at 60 days, this section, this mixture of turf grasses here has that kind of dead yellowish brownish color, and the tall fescues, just as the fine fescues, tended to have some green, maintain some of that green color even after 2 months with no water. And once again, after that 28-day recovery period, you can see they all came back and turned green. But again, and especially in this mixture, whether it was the 2-inch or the 3.5-inch Haida cut, you start to see some of these grayish spots. And essentially what this tells us and lets us educate the public is to say, after 14 days, and we took pictures, but I just decided to show these at 14, 60, and then 28 days. But maintaining a higher height of cut allows the turf to, stay healthy and I guess green, you could say, for longer periods of time than if you were to cut it at a shorter height of cut. And then ultimately, when it comes to different varieties and mixtures, we can educate the public and let them know, hey, if you want something that's a little more drought tolerant, maybe you go with a tall or a fine fescue over these perennial ryegrass mixtures. Another question that I get asked a lot when it comes to mowing is, what should I do with my clippings? And I'm going to suggest in most cases that you should not remove them from your yard. And there are exceptions to the rule, and I feel that's, in just about everything, there seems to be an exception to the rule. And I'm going to talk about those in a second. But there's many benefits to the clippings that come off of a lawnmower. Number one, it's a natural fertilizer. Typically, when you go to a store, the fertilizer bag is going to tell you how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are in that fertilizer mix. And these clippings have small amounts of those 3 nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. In addition, it's going to add some organic matter to the soil, and that helps with the water holding capacity of the soil. Now, if you do happen to remove them, these clippings, they can also be composted, and they can use as mulch in other areas of your landscape, whether it be your gardens or your flower beds. Now, some of the times where I might suggest you remove those clippings is if you notice you have some turf disease. Say it's, in one corner of your yard. As you mow and spread those clippings, that disease is going to spread as well. And so that might be an instance when you can remove those clippings. The picture on the right illustrates that second bullet point of scalping the turf. And that's, where you cut it really short. Or on the other end of the spectrum, maybe you let it grow to be excessively long. And when you cut off excessive amounts of, turf grass, you're going to be left with excess clippings. And what happens is underneath these, brown piles of clippings, if it's a hot summer day, it's going to get hot and very humid underneath there. And you might see some of those plants start to die off. In addition, it's hard for nutrients to get through that layer of excessive clippings. And in general, if you have excessive clippings, that might be a time where you can remove them. When it comes to safety, some mowers, they can't be used unless you have a collection bag. And of course, we want everyone to be as safe as possible when mowing their landscapes. One I want to focus on just a little bit more is what to do when clippings end up on the sidewalks or in gutters. And so this picture here, you might have seen this somewhere in your neighborhood or around the city that you live in. But oftentimes when we don't mow with a collection bag or things like that, the clippings, they do end up back on the lawn and landscape, but they can also end up in sidewalks and gutters. And these surfaces, when water hits them, water doesn't absorb into the soil profile, or it doesn't absorb into the concrete as it does soil with, And so when rain occurs, or maybe you have a misaligned sprinkler head, it's going to send all of those clippings to a storm drain somewhere. And this picture on the right is a picture that I took, and it was, where excessive clippings, and you can even see a little bit of trash there, almost ended up in one of these storm drains. I decided to collect this though and make it so that it didn't end up in the storm drain system, because those storm drains, eventually end up in our water system. And I have a little URL there. I'd like to make a plug for the Adopt a Drain program. It's kind of a fun little program where you can go and adopt a storm drain in your neighborhood, and you can collect the debris and things that would end up in the storm drain, and you actually weigh them, and they keep track of how much, whether it's trash or lawn clippings, would have potentially ended up, somewhere downstream. Now, I mentioned these storm drains and lawn clippings because eventually, again, they might end up in our lakes, streams, and water supply, and they can cause nutrient pollution. And what essentially that is where those lawn clippings, which have, small amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, they end up in a lake, and algae likes those nutrients and begins to bloom and grow. And it can create these harmful and toxic algal blooms. If you've kept up with the news, you might have, seen that several beaches in the Twin Cities metro area have closed due to these toxo-algal blooms. And they can be both damaging to us as humans and animals. And I include fish in those animals because algae being a plant, it needs oxygen, and it gets a lot of that oxygen from the water. And so in some severe cases, the algal blooms can actually absorb almost all of the oxygen within the water, meaning the fish have nothing to breathe, and you might see a mass fish kill off because of that. And it's not all because of the lawn clippings that end up in there, but they do play a part, and it's something that we can help to manage a little bit better. Now, when it comes to this nutrient pollution idea, a lot of people talk about fertilizers and how they can cause some issues. And while they do have their place and they do cause nutrient pollution, I want to advocate, for fertilizers that when they're used correctly, they can help improve and maintain the lawn, and they have many benefits. They help limit erosion, they help cool the environment, and ultimately help, people have the green landscapes that we want. Some people, no matter what you tell them, they are going to want to have the best lawn in the neighborhood, no matter what it takes. And this picture here on the right kind of illustrates what a lawn might look like without fertilizer versus with fertilizer. And for most people, the lawn on the left is going to be enough. But for some people, they're going to want, again, to have the best lawn in the neighborhood. And something that I've found out too is when someone has a lawn that's not quite as green as they want, one of the first things they think is the issue is that they need to add more water. And so I think, proper fertilizer management is something that can also limit water use, since that's one of the first things people think is the issue when it comes to having a green lawn. Now, when it comes to how much fertilizer you need, the first thing I would suggest you do is to get some soil from your yard, go 3 or 4 inches deep, and send that soil sample to a laboratory whether here at the University of Minnesota or somewhere close by to you. Now, these tests are inexpensive. I have this little red box here showing that they cost $17 for the regular test. And that includes, you get to find out how much organic matter is in your soil, how much phosphorus, potassium, and a few other things. You might notice that nitrogen isn't listed there. And they have a little point down here about nitrogen, and it's a little bit small to read, but nitrogen is extremely mobile in the soil. And so the nitrogen recommendations you might get from a test like this are based on the plants that are growing in the area of the soil that you took, and also the soil organic matter that is in there. And again, this is something that's pretty cheap to do. You just go out there and, like I said, dig up 3 or 4 inches of soil in your area in a couple of places, and they give some recommendations on how to do that. And it's something that might help you down the road when you buy a bag of fertilizer with a lot of phosphorus and potassium. You may learn from this soil test you don't need any phosphorus and potassium because there's already enough of that in the soil profile itself. Now, we typically recommend, and when it comes to nitrogen, that's kind of the big nutrient that people talk about when it comes to fertilizing a lawn or landscape. And we suggest you apply about 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. Now, depending on how you maintain your lawn, you may need to do that more than once a year, or you may not need to do it at all. But in either case, I want to give an example of how to kind of figure out exactly how much 1 pound per 1,000 square feet is. So if we go through this example of a 1/4 acre lot, that's between 10 and 11,000 square feet. And to make the math just a little easier, I will say, about half of that is covered by your home, driveways, maybe you have a garden in the backyard. And so that means you have about 5,000 square feet of lawn, which you need to apply fertilizer to. So again, if we're looking for that 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet, you're going to go to the store and you're going to buy a bag of fertilizer. Now, each bag of fertilizer is going to have 3 numbers on them. And this first number, the first number on the left that you see, that corresponds to nitrogen. The second number to phosphorus, the third number to potassium. And what this 32 means is that in this 50-pound bag of fertilizer, 32% of it is nitrogen. And that boils down to 16 pounds of that bag is nitrogen, even though there's 50 pounds of fertilizer in the bag. So when you kind of flip that script, that means a little over 3 pounds of fertilizer equals 1 pound of nitrogen. Now, if we know we have a 5,000 square foot yard and we want to apply 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet, we know 3 pounds of fertilizer equals 1 pound of nitrogen, meaning we need to apply approximately 15 pounds of fertilizer to our yard to get that 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. Now, I went through that pretty fast, and I have some websites or URLs down there listed below. They go into more detail on how exactly to calculate this. And once you kind of have this number down, you need to calibrate the spreader that you're going to be using for your fertilizer application. And that takes a little bit of work as well. But again, all of these URLs that I have listed below will be put on our website along with this presentation. So you can go back and kind of go through those calculations in more detail if you'd like to. Now, we've talked about so far mowing and fertilization. So I just barely quickly want to talk about some of the characteristics you might see with various lawn maintenance programs. So we have here, levels of maintenance going from low or very low to high. And you can see as your level of maintenance increases, typically your mowing height goes down a little bit. The amount of times you apply fertilizer goes up. And this isn't the answer all for every single lawn and every single scenario. but I would tend to put most people in the category of the low or medium maintenance as far as their lawn needs go. And when you look there on the right, we also have listed some of the best adapted turfgrass species for these types of maintenance. But mainly I just wanted to point this out that as you raise your mowing height, as you maybe reduce some of those fertilizer inputs, it's going to require less maintenance for your lawn. And so whether you're a homeowner or someone who goes out in the public and educates others on how to maybe properly maintain their lawns and landscapes, this is a quick little view of what you might be able to tell them if they want to decrease the amount of maintenance required for their lawns and landscapes. Now for the final few minutes, I just want to talk about some other maintenance practices. And so we'll jump right into aeration. This is something I feel a lot of people are familiar with and know what it is, but don't really know how it affects the yard and what it actually does. And so, like I said, a lot of people are familiar with those little soil cores that come out of the ground. But this little illustration kind of tells a story of what exactly aeration is doing to your yard. You typically aerate when you have very compacted soils. And with compacted soils, those roots aren't able to grow very deep. And that can result in a thin lawn, or just maybe looking kind of sickly and things. It's very easy to destroy the yard if you have a lot of traffic on it, things like that. But when you aerate, you open up those little soil cores, and it allows air and water to infiltrate that soil profile. And as that soil profile opens and becomes less compacted, it allows those roots to grow deeper, and ultimately you have a healthier turfgrass canopy. And to kind of put these out in so that you can read them here, some of those benefits again, it reduces that soil compaction. It improves that water and oxygen infiltration within that soil profile. It can also help increase the drainage of water through the soil profile. So rather than you watering and seeing kind of pools of water or some runoff happening, it's going to allow that soil to go through that allow that water to go through the soil profile. And ultimately that all accumulates into improved root growth. And kind of going back to the mowing heights, if you have deeper roots, it's able to access the water deeper in that soil profile, meaning you don't have to water quite as often because those roots are able to go down deep and grab some water from there. Coming to thatch management, I think this is something people are less familiar with. They may have heard the term, but it's essentially a little layer between the turfgrass canopy and it's above the soil line. It's made of living and dead organic material. And this picture kind of illustrates, right below that turfgrass canopy, but above this soil profile. And it's primarily made of parts of the turfgrass plant, including the roots, the rhizomes, the crowns, and that's where that thatch layer comes from. Now, when it comes to thatch, it's one of those things where it's almost like too much of a good thing. You need some thatch in your lawns, but if you have too much of it, it starts to be detrimental to the lawn and landscape. And one thing, if you turn your attention there to the bottom right picture, a lot of people, when they see the thatch, they often think, oh, that looks like a bunch of lawn clippings, so maybe I'll remove my clippings and it'll reduce, my thatch layer. But that's kind of a misconception because those lawn clippings, they biodegrade fairly rapidly and add very little to that thatch layer, because again, that thatch layer is primarily made up of, crowns of the plant, roots, things like that. And as we just talked about aeration, this is also something that can reduce that thatch layer as you kind of punch out those little soil cores that you saw earlier. Now, some of the benefits and negative impacts, again, about a ½ inch is the most that you want. And so anything kind of below that, it creates a good environment for those microorganisms that are actually helpful for the most part when it comes to, soil health and things. It also helps to protect that crown, and it also reduces weed germination because those weeds don't quite get to the soil layer so they can grow up and compete with the turf grass. But once you get above that 1/2 inch, you start to limit some of that root penetration. Because the thatch kind of lifts up the turf grass plants, you might to start to cut off some of those crowns of the plant. And again, if you cut off those crowns, it injures and damages the plants and makes it susceptible to a variety of issues. In addition, the water, when you water, that thatch layer can become hydrophobic, meaning, it doesn't really like water, and it's going to lead to runoff. So the water is not going to reach the soil profile as easily. And in addition to kind of filtering out that water, if you do happen to apply any sort of pesticide or herbicide, it may not reach the target that the pest or the weed that you're trying to kill. As far as overseeding, to go over this one just real quick, it improves weed resistance by providing a dense and thick turf grass canopy. But most oftentimes people associate overseeding, as the picture shows, with covering up bare spots. Or if you have a lawn that you want, you can either sod your yard or you can seed your yard. And so that's where, a lot of times that overseeding comes into play. And it also helps, reduce soil runoff. If you have a big bare spot, when it rains, it's going to turn muddy and send a lot of that soil and nutrients somewhere where it doesn't need to be. Whereas when you overseed, you get some grass and it kind of keeps that soil profile together. To briefly describe how this is done, it's something that you can do, this time of year. This is the ideal time to be overseeding, and in fact, doing many of these practices that we've talked about. But when you overseed, you need to make sure there's good seed to soil contact. And a lot of times you can do that by kind of raking in the seed. And there's also some specialized machinery you can rent and things that'll help you do that. But typically just a rake is something that'll do fine. And once you've done that, you need to water it often to keep the seeds in the soil moist. But once you start to see some germination, you might want to cut back on that water a little bit so that those roots can develop and go deep into that soil. So again, we talked about a lot of things and I went over them fairly quickly, but this Minnesota Lawn Care Calendar kind of gives a brief overview of when it's appropriate to do the activities I've been talking about. And I put this box here from August, September, and October, because as you can see, these are kind of the preferable times to fertilize, to aerate your lawns. If you have a lot of thatch, to dethatch that lawn, where you can seed or sod. And again, these A's represent times where things are acceptable. But you can see a lot of the times that you need to preferably do lawn maintenance is in the fall as we get ready for winter. Because as you prepare your lawn for the fall, and as we'll talk about in our next webinar, the things you do in the fall will help prepare your lawn for the year to come. And again, a lot of these materials and tables that I've talked about are going to be online on our website, that you can follow the links to those other web pages and get some more detailed information on the things I've talked about today. But again, we'd ask you to join us for our final webinar in 3 weeks, talking about winterizing your lawn. And if we don't get to your questions today, feel free to reach out to me. There's some of my contact information in the bottom left. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chris, and Brian, Eric, and I will do our best to answer your questions.
Okay, so one question that I answered within the chat or within the Q&A box is I put the link again for where the webinars are reposted. So you can look in the Q&A box and see that. So our first question, and this goes back to the beginning of your webinar, where are your research plots located at the Arboretum?
So it's kind of at it's on the north side. So usually when you come into the Arboretum, you'll kind of take a left and you'll go on that 3-mile drive. But there's a little one-way kind of street that you can take that'll take you in a little loop, and it'll take you to the overflow parking, which they haven't really used up to this point since they only allow, so many people there. But it's right next to Building C. And again, if you park in the parking lot and you see there's kind of this big house made of twigs and things, it's just north of that big house, kind of where they're building they're building a new bike path currently as well that goes through the Arboretum. It's right along. That maybe not be the best answer, but that it's kind of on the north side by that big twig house and Building C where some of the bathrooms are.
Okay, so we just had a comment. Great presentation. So nice job, Shane. And we have one other comment. That someone was appreciative and they wanted to thank you for removing those grass clippings from that storm drain. Okay, so on to our next question. And so this one is for Shane, and it's possible that Eric might want to chime in on this one too. Can you recommend a fertilizer that is not toxic to animals and humans?
So I'll go first real quick, Eric. But fertilizers, there's a lot that are, a lot of people buy them at the stores. Obviously, you buy those 50-pound bags. There's also a lot of natural fertilizers. I'm not too familiar with those. But one thing I will suggest is if you do get for example, a urea fertilizer, which basically only contains nitrogen, that you should get slow release fertilizers. And that basically means they have little coatings on them so that as soon as, a rainfall event occurs, not 100% of that fertilizer goes into the soil. It might take a couple rain events for that little shell to biodegrade. And so that would be my one suggestion. I don't have any natural fertilizers I know off the top of my head, but one thing I would suggest is getting a slow release fertilizer. I don't know if you have anything to add, Eric.
Yeah, I think for the most part, the fertilizer, just plain fertilizer that you're going to use on lawn are pretty safe, especially when applied properly. So most of the problems with fertilizers are when people, are environmental, when people over apply, are kind of sloppy with cleanup and applying onto hard surfaces, things like that. So for the most part, the fertilizers you're going to find at your local supplier are going to be pretty safe. It's more of a matter of just using them properly, putting the fertilizer on at the right time, at the right rate, and using best practices for application.
Okay, so the next question is one that I can answer. Will this webinar be sent to all registrants so it can be shared later? We have just one main event page, and I will be sending that out to everyone after the webinar is over tomorrow. And that will have the link to our event page. And as soon as I am finished with the video, so I do some editing of it for accessibility, I'll put that link on that page that our event page that I've typed out into the answer box, and also I'll send that out as an email too. Okay, so let's go to the next question. Can you talk about organic lawn care, both in fertilizing and in weed control? Again, this might be Shane, and then Eric might have something to say too.
Yeah, so again, I'm not super familiar with very many of the organic options that are available, but something I know, there's many companies out there. For example, one of the smart irrigation controller companies, Rachio, they offer a fertilizer service as well. And, they, in the emails and things that they send, they always mention they are organically based and things like that. But other than that, I don't have much information regarding those kind of organic or more, I guess you could say, environmentally friendly fertilizers.
So yeah, there are several that you would call organic fertilizers: corn gluten meal, Sustain, which is a poultry manure, Lorgonite. Those are the primary ones. So in terms of organic products for fertilizer, there's several options. Some of them have phosphorus levels that are a little too high to be technically legal in Minnesota on established lawn. But for organic weed control, there's very limited options. That's one of the great challenges in the organic turf management world, is trying to figure out weed control. So right now there's some options, but they, very few work very well. Most of what you would do to reduce weeds in an organic management situation is just make sure the lawn's thick and healthy, making sure there's not a way for those weeds to get in.
And also, I guess you can become more tolerant of weeds if you're into an organic lawn. Okay, so the next question is, I have clay. Can I aerate, break up the plugs, and overlay topsoil? And I guess I'll send that one to Shane.
Eric, it looked like you were ready to answer that. I can kind of follow up if anything you say.
Yeah, I think, so the question was, you have clay soils, aerating and breaking up those cores is good practice. And then what was the rest of the question? Like adding in additional?
Can I aerate, rake up the plugs, and overlay topsoil? So they want to add some topsoil after they aerate.
You could certainly do that. A lot of times you don't want to be mixing up different types of soils in the same profile. So I think you're better off just aerating and, getting those plugs broken down. That's going to do quite a bit for your lawn, probably. Kind of depend. And it depends on what kind of soils you have. But I think in general, just aerating, breaking up those plugs will work fairly well.
Yeah, and I'd agree with what Eric said there, as in mixing those soils can sometimes be a bad idea. Certain soil mixtures and types can actually become even more compacted, can almost become cement-like. If you get, maybe if you turn a clay maybe into more of a sandy clay loam or something by adding sandy soils to that clay, you might actually compound the issue rather than reduce it.
Okay, so the next question, when is the best time of year to aerate? And that could be for Shane.
Yeah, so aeration is one of those things, going back, if I kind of go up to this kind of calendar that we've had made by a previous extension agent here, fall is kind of the best time if we focus here on aeration. That's when you can do it. It's kind of getting your lawn ready for winter time. But if you don't happen to be able to do it, maybe you're not available in the next couple of weeks to do that, it is also something that you can do at the beginning of the season. But as far as, maybe best management practices, about now is the time, because the cool season grasses that we have around here are starting to thrive, starting to outcompete those weeds. And so as you aerate, those profiles will be filled up with grass rather than weeds.
Okay, so this is an interesting question. Last year, I canceled the aeration when I learned the company does not clean the equipment between customers. I do not want jumping worms. What are your recommendations?
Yeah, so one of the first slides I talked about, was seed contamination with mowers. The same thing goes with those kind of aeration machines that you can get a lot of, as you said, you might get some pest contamination, some seed contamination. One thing you can do if your lawn isn't very big, you can go and buy one of those little core aerators that you can just do yourself. And if that's out of the question, many lawn care stores and things, you can actually go and rent one of those machines. And so that's obviously a lot less expensive than purchasing your own. You can go and rent one rather than hiring someone and do it yourself.
Okay, so the next question is, do you need to seed immediately after aerating?
Eric, I don't know if you'd have maybe a little better handle on that one than I would.
You certainly don't need to. One of the nice things about aeration is it's opening up some space, some soil for good seed to soil contact for seeding. You wouldn't have to seed right after aerating. You could wait for a little while because you've still got that increase in space for seed to drop, and also that increased chance of seed to soil contact. I think, the closer to aeration you can seed, the better off you're going to be to get some of those benefits, but it doesn't have to be done right afterwards.
Okay. How often do you need to aerate a lawn?
I'd say it's one of those things that comes down to how you want to manage your lawn and your landscape. If you have a lot of traction and things, maybe you do it once at the beginning of the year, once at the end of the year, around this time. But typically, if you might be able to do it every couple of years, you might be able to do it once a year. I think it comes down to how much the area is getting used and how much maintenance and things you want to put into your yard. But I typically suggest at least once a year. And maybe if you have a lot of traffic on your yard, maybe do it once at the beginning, once at the end of the season.
And I'd add, I think, aeration, it really depends on soil type. So soil type, and like Shane said, your expectations. There's many good lawns around that don't get aerated pretty much at all, probably. But if you have a soil that's going to compact a lot and maybe a higher traffic situation, I think those are good situations where you might aerate more frequently.
Okay, so the next one is just a comment. This is one of the best Zoom classes I have experienced. Thank you. You're welcome. Okay, so the next question is, what is the crown of the plant?
So you kind of have, I guess you could say, and Eric, you can maybe expound a little bit more on this, but 3 parts of a turfgrass plant. You kind of have the roots, which are below ground. You have the area where the crown is, which is kind of right near that soil surface. And then you have the leaves, which, eventually becomes the lawn clippings that we all do there. And so the crown is typically very close to that soil. And kind of going back to thatch, as the thatch increases, that crown might be raised a little bit, but that's kind of the heart of the plant where the leaf shoots come from. And so if that gets cut while you're mowing your lawn, it's typically it takes a while to recover from that, because that's kind of I guess you could say heart of the plant. I don't know if that's the best analogy, but.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that, that's exactly right. So everything comes from the crown, the leaf tissue, the roots come from the crown. So the crown is what has to stay alive for the plant to stay alive. So if that crown dies, the plant's going to die. So when we think about anything we do in the lawn maintenance, including, getting through winter, things like that, is always trying to protect the crown. If we have a grass that is less winter hardy, a lot of times what happens is that crown gets damaged and is not able to survive cold temperatures in the winter. So in that case, the crown dies, the plant dies. Same thing in the summer. If you damage the crown, the plant's going to die.
Okay, the next question. Which is best, to leave the cores on the lawn or rake them up?
Go ahead, Eric.
I can take that one quick. I think it's leaving them on is usually just fine. I think there might be situations where you want to rake it up, but incorporating that soil back into the lawn is often, the best thing to do, and it's easier, and it keeps that soil on your lawn, and you still get the benefit of the aeration, but you're not losing soil material from your lawn.
Okay, I can't see the link to view the recording. So I did put that in the Q&A box, but maybe Shane, maybe you can go back to that slide and just keep that link up so everyone can see that. I think that was one of your very first slides. Yep, there we go. So there it is right there. That will have everything you need, information about our next seminar or our next webinar. The previous recordings and this recording, which I will have up in a few days.
Yeah, and I will add to that, Chris, when you go to the web page, it's not like YouTube where you see a big video link kind of embedded on the web page. You have to go down, you kind of have to scroll down to the section that says previous webinars, and then there'll be a little link from there that you can click. And when you click on that link, that's when you'll see that little thumbnail with the video and all the extra links that are associated with that video.
Okay, so the next question is, I've just overseeded an existing lawn. Can I still spray weeds?
You can, it kind of depends on the weeds that you're going to spray. So if you just overseeded, it kind of depends on the weeds. So you wouldn't want to mess around with any grassy weeds because the herbicide could certainly affect your seedlings. But even herbicides that affect broadleaf weeds, like let's say dandelion or something like that, I wouldn't use them now because those seedlings that are germinating are going to be more susceptible to some damage from those herbicides, even if there's herbicides that are generally safe on mature turfgrass. So at this time of year, I wouldn't apply herbicides at all. Most of your weeds that are a problem in turfgrasses in Minnesota, you're going to spray in the spring anyway. So I would probably leave the lawn be in terms of herbicide use so that those seedlings can grow well and establish without having any damage.
Okay, this is kind of a related question. It's another weed question. How can I get rid of creeping Charlie? Is there a non-pesticide way to do it? Well, I think that's an Eric question.
Yeah, so there is a pesticide way to do it, and that would be one of the few things you'd apply in the fall. So for those of you who, not the person who asked the question, but for other people, you can spray out creeping Charlie in the fall using herbicides that include triclopyr. And it often takes a couple applications, and you should really start doing it after first frost because the herbicide is a little more effective then. I get this question a lot though about non-herbicide options for creeping Charlie, and there really aren't any. You can pull it, that's an option. And you can do your best to make sure your turf is healthy and thick. So a lot of times creeping Charlie is a problem in shade. So maybe you're growing, thinking back to our last webinar, maybe you're growing Kentucky bluegrass in a shady site and it's not very dense and thick. Well, in that situation, you're going to have more openings for creeping Charlie to come in. Maybe if you switch to a species that's a little bit more adapted to the shade, like some of the fine fescues are, maybe that would take care of it. But there's not a real easy solution if you're not going to use herbicides. And even herbicides are a little difficult. Creeping Charlie is a really tough weed to control.
So the next question, Shane, this person wants to see the soil test URL. Could you go back to that slide? I think it's a couple ahead of this slide, if I am remembering.
Let's see here.
Yeah,
There
right
it is
there.
right there. And this is the university's soil testing laboratory. There are other ones, but.
Okay, so let's move on to the next question. We still kind of have a lot, so we'll keep going here for a little bit longer. Could you speak to the efficacy of chemicals like humic acid for lawn care? So maybe that's an Eric question.
So I really can't because there's been very little research done on those kind of materials. So some of them might work well, some might not. There's just not a lot of really good data. You'll hear about a lot of things like that might have some benefits, but it's not really clear that there are benefits, and there's just not a lot of information out there about them. I think, thinking about growing a healthy lawn, making sure that the turf has the nutrients that it needs without having very much environmental impact. What Shane talked about earlier, making sure you're taking a soil test and then applying fertilizer properly at the right rates is probably your best bet. But we do hear about materials like that quite a bit, and we just don't have a lot of information in terms of their efficacy in turfgrass systems.
Okay, so the next question, what about cornmeal gluten? And I'm not sure if they're talking about it as a fertilizer or as a weed control, but maybe Eric has some comments on that.
Yeah, so corn gluten meal, I mentioned earlier, is an organic fertilizer. It also has been shown to have some ability to act as a pre-emergent herbicide. So a herbicide that can reduce the growth of weeds when they're really young and germinating. The effect, however, of the herbicidal effects of the corn gluten meal takes some time. So it'd be a situation where you're building up corn gluten meal in the soil over several years. So it's not an instant effect whereby you apply corn gluten meal and all of a sudden you have weed control. But there is some quite a bit of data out there to suggest that it does work. So if you had an organic, a plan for organic turf management where you're repeatedly using corn gluten meal, you should start to see some benefits, maybe reduce dandelion populations, things like that over time, if you're consistent with the applications.
Okay, so our next question, and this can go to Shane. Should I apply phosphorus on my lawn?
So typically I'm, fairly new here to Minnesota, but from what I've learned about a lot of the soils in the area is there's a lot of phosphorus within the soil already. And so with that being said, and, as I mentioned in the webinar, it's not the answer for every single person in every single situation, but typically most lawns need some nitrogen and maybe a little bit of sulfur to add. And a lot of times the native soil in the area has plenty of phosphorus and potassium. So I'd say you may not need it, but that's something that a soil test could tell you.
Okay, so our next question, is tall fescue a viable option for cold environments like zone 3? I've seen in a past blog post that seemed to suggest it may not be viable in the long term in more colder winters. That can go for Eric.
So tall fescue traditionally has been not recommended for zones similar to what we have in Minnesota. However, the more we look at it, I think it's possible. It depends on your site. So if you have a site where you don't expect a lot of standing water during the winter, I think it'll survive, especially if there's snow cover. It's certainly not as poor a performer as perennial ryegrass in the winter, but it is not, it's not as good as, let's say, Kentucky bluegrass for winter survival. But in Minnesota, we're seeing more and more tall fescue use, and I think it works pretty well. Like I said, ice cover can be a problem. It does also get a fair bit of snow mold disease in the spring, and it takes a little longer to green up in the spring. So the lawn may not be green quite as quickly as you're used to with Kentucky bluegrass, but it's got some really good attributes. It's pretty wear tolerant. It doesn't need to be watered very much. So I think it's still worth considering in mixtures, especially as you go north in Minnesota.
Okay. My lawn this season has more weeds than usual, and I do not know what's going on. I would like to have an assessment. Is that offered by University of Minnesota Turfgrass?
We do not come out to do those kind of assessments. We have a lot of resources online for, identifying weeds and so forth. There are some lawn care companies that will do that kind of thing and come out. We just don't have the capacity to come out and do individual home lawn site assessments, but you can find companies that will, come out and do that for you. In a situation like that where there's a lot of weeds in a lawn, you'll probably be able to figure out a fair bit of a solution just by kind of brushing up on some basic turfgrass management resources that are available through University of Minnesota Extension.
Is it worthless to add topsoil over tree roots if it seems the soil is going to get washed away over time? So I guess this is in cases where there's the lawn hasn't established due to shade and the tree root competition.
Yeah, I guess that doesn't seem like it would be that effective. If there's not topsoil, you're going to have a hard time growing grass. But a lot of times when the roots of the tree are that close to the surface and it's shady already, it's probably not a great place to grow grass anyway. Might be wise to mulch that area. It's hard to know without seeing it. But.
Yeah, that was going to be my recommendation, is maybe instead of adding a bunch of topsoil, throw down some mulch, maybe put in, some flowers or something, make a flower bed around the tree rather than trying to get a turf grass stand there.
Okay, so my clay soil is so heavy and compacted that the hand core aerator tool doesn't work. can I use a pitchfork to poke deep down and slightly lift the soil instead?
So a pitchfork, if you look up aeration on, if you do like a Google image search, you might see that there's some shoes that have like nails in them that you can walk along your yard. And I think, it is going to help. It's going to help, it's going to open up that soil a little bit. But at the same time, unlike those core aerators or an aeration machine, instead of pulling out a soil core, you're essentially compacting, I guess, the soil down into the bottom of the hole a little deeper. And so I think it's good, but maybe long term you might see a little bit more of compaction. And I don't know if you might have anything more to add to that, Eric, but I think it does, help, because obviously you're opening up those soil pores. But since the core isn't actually being pulled out and it's being kind of more compacted, you might see some more compaction further down the road.
Yeah, I think, it might work depending on the soil, but, in general, in a situation like that, it might be worth it, just spending some money on hiring somebody to come out and do it. It's not something that has to be done every year, maybe every few years or something. And in a soil that's tough to do like that, I think, hiring a professional might be wise.
Okay, so another aeration question. The step-on tool to aerate in the photo that Shane showed, is that too hard to do yourself?
I think that might depend on a couple factors. One, kind of how physically active and healthy you are. As me, as a younger 29-year-old, like, it may not be quite as difficult for me, who's someone maybe a little older. But it also comes down to how compacted it is. It can sometimes be hard to, get that kind of stomp in the ground and get that core out of there. But I'd say generally it's not super difficult. And I don't know, Brian, you have one of these core aerators. Would you be able to talk a little bit about your experience in your yard?
Sure, I have one. I used it about 2 weeks ago in our yard. We do not have a large yard, so the core aerator that I bought, which has two little cores, little cylinders on it, is sufficient for the size of our yard. It was easy to use. We do not have clay soil here, so that might have been something that helped. When you push it down, it pushes the soil, of course, goes into that cylinder, and then when you go to the next spot and push it down, it pushes the previous core up out the top, and that seems to work pretty well. It does get clogged occasionally in very compacted areas where there are lots of roots, and so I found that I had to occasionally take a hose and just jet out and kind of push out with a screwdriver some of the compacted stuff. But I kind of got the hang of it after a while, and that stopped happening as often. So it's a little bit of a workout, yes. If you have a smaller yard, I would say it's a viable option. And when I say smaller, I mean like a 1920s bungalow size lot, in the city. If you have a larger suburban yard, you could definitely do it. It's just going to take you a long time, to go around your entire yard in that case. But it worked for me.
Okay, so the next question, I think this was the Eric question. We had great sod for years in areas that now have tended to go to moss. Is there a way to overcome that?
So you're probably in a situation where there's a lot of moisture in those areas. So whatever you can do to reduce the moisture, whether it be, getting some more air movement there, or things like aeration, or looking at how water is moving through the site, maybe using better, like I said before, trying species that are well adapted to shaded conditions, because you're probably talking about a shaded condition. So something's happened to your site that's made it too wet, probably for the turf, too wet and shady for the turf grass that you currently have, is my guess. And so you have to think about, well, what can I do can I do anything to the environment? And if I can't do anything to the environment, maybe you have to think about switching species to something that's more well adapted to that kind of site.
Okay, we are by a lake and have a lot of goose droppings on our lawn. Is it necessary to remove these droppings? I guess Eric, maybe that.
I don't think it is. I guess it depends on how many there are. I don't know. It's hard to know without. I would guess not, but I suppose there could be a point where there's just too much, and you're going to have some problems with the turf. But
Yeah, I might add to that. It's kind of one of those, it's manure, it's an organic fertilizer, and maybe something you could do is mow over your yard just a couple of times and maybe mulch it. That'll kind of, grind it up, maybe spread it out a little more. But then at the same time, going over it with that, you might have to sharpen your blade after with all, cutting all of those droppings and things. But that might be something you could do.
Okay, so our last question. Should I cut my lawn lower before snow to prevent snow mold? And that can be an Eric question.
yeah, so that's a good, fairly good practice to kind of start reducing that mowing height a little bit, especially on a very winter hardy grass. I would, if you've got a turf variety that's just not great in the winter, I might recommend not doing this. But in general, like Kentucky bluegrass, for instance, and fine fescues, yeah, reducing that mowing height a little bit as you go into winter can help with that. Another thing to do is be careful on leaf mulching. So we typically recommend that you should mulch your leaves into your lawn. But in situations where you have a lot of leaf material, it might be good to do some removal towards the end of the season, because I know I've seen where you get situations where you're just building up these large quantities of leaf material on the lawn, and you're going to end up with more snow mold disease. You're going to have a lot of plant material for that snow mold to feed off of. So mow lower, and then just make sure you're not piling up a lot of leaf mulch going into the winter.
Okay, that was it for questions.
Yeah, thank you everyone for your questions. And I think that last question was a good one to end on, as it kind of leads into a little bit about what our webinar is going to be on in 3 weeks, about winterizing your lawn. We look forward to you joining us then. And until then, we'll see you in 3 weeks. Thanks, everyone.